Now, a Department of Government efficiency might make the government run more smoothly, but it doesn't address the core issue that the government has morphed into a political system that the founders never intended. The real problem isn't that the government isn't efficient enough. We all know it isn't. It's that the government is too damn big, too centralized, and has too much power. What I mean to say is streamlining an agency or a department whose existence itself is the corruption doesn't get rid of the damage it is doing. It only, it'll only reduce the damage to a more tolerable level.
America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. Is DOGE enough? Welcome to the Liberty Brief Podcast, episode 27. I'm your host, Robert Melso. You know, there's a flurry of activity swirling around the new Trump administration, all of it positive, at least for some of us. It seems I'm breaking out popcorn every night and sitting back to enjoy the news of the day, especially the reactions of the people trying to defend the grift and the corruption they need to survive. What we sensed was going on is now being exposed for all to see. Finally, the corruption of the federal government, the hidden agendas, the secret slush funds, the hijacked federal agencies, and the billions, if not trillions, of unaccounted for tax dollars being brought to light. So much for conspiracy theories. Well, they're theories until they're confirmed. One of the major things President Trump promised was to take a hard look at government inefficiency, fraud, and waste. At the center of it all is Elon Musk. The Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, was created to make the government more efficient, less costly, and less onerous. But will DOGE be enough? Is DOGE merely treating a symptom of the greater threat to our liberties and the unique form of federal government we were intended to have? Now, Dr. Tom and I have talked privately, and we've concluded that eliminating the waste, the bloat, inefficiency, and fraud of those in the federal government, though necessary and desperately needed as a first step, may miss the real problem. In today's episode, we'd like to review the history of how we got so far off track. How did it all start? When and why did we go from a Republican form of government with limited privileges, no police powers, no central bank, no lumbering autonomous rulemaking agencies at the federal level, to the expansive national government we have today? So, Dr. Tom, welcome back.
Hi, Rob. Always glad to talk about this stuff. We took a very long hiatus, maybe too long, but we had to get some things off the ground that required our undivided attention. So I guess we're back now.
Yeah, well, we're freed up now, and I'm excited to return to the podcast, Dr. Tom. I think we can place the Article 5 Convention of States on the back burner for now.
Maybe, but it would be wise to keep it on a low flame. Let's see if the Republicans can maintain a united front for at least the next 2 years. Now, this administration should be laying the footing. We need to support Article 5 amendments with minimal resistance if the Republicans can't complete their agenda by the end of the Trump administration.
Yeah, so Dr. Tom, let's get right to it. A lot of people are ecstatic with DOGE. I'm a little taken aback by some of the pushback from some of my liberal friends. They're afraid that we've gone a little bit too far, that these agencies will be compromised, that their social security numbers will be stolen, that Elon Musk is going to take all the money out of Fort Knox and so forth. It just seems very strange what they're saying.
It's a lot of malarkey.
I just don't get that.
Well, Rob, look, I think it's a good idea. If it's as good in practice, and it seems to be, as it sounds on paper, it's a good thing. I mean, who doesn't want a more efficient government, right? But I'm praying it is not just putting a fresh coat of paint on a house with a crumbling foundation. There will always be hysterical resistance and pushback. We're seeing it. We're seeing it already. Too many entrenched interests have too much to lose. We are at the point where Mr. Trump is the only agent who can stop and hopefully reverse the slow motion hijacking of the United States federal government. Now, a Department of Government efficiency might make the government run more smoothly, but it doesn't address the core issue that the government has morphed into a political system that the founders never intended. The real problem isn't that the government isn't efficient enough. We all know it isn't. It's that the government is too damn big, too centralized, and has too much power. What I mean to say is streamlining an agency or a department whose existence itself is the corruption doesn't get rid of the damage it is doing. It only, it'll only reduce the damage to a more tolerable level.
That's a strong statement. So you're saying this isn't just about bloat, but about the fundamental structure of government.
Exactly. It's about the loss of our original system of dual sovereignty, where the power was divided between the states and the federal government. We've moved away from the republic that we were intended to have. The 10th Amendment is merely a parchment partition. We now have dozens and dozens of regulatory agencies staffed by 150,000 GS 1811s. The bureaucracy employs 3 million people. The 16 privileges permitted to the federal government have expanded to over 185,000 pages of federal rules and regulations. And this is above and beyond the U.S. Code. Right? There is a private central bank controlling our economy, as well as a judiciary that doesn't seem to understand the separation of powers with too much authority to ruin our lives with activism. Our Constitution is just about in tatters.
I'm almost fearful that we're breaking some rules and regulations right now that we don't know about.
Oh, we probably are.
So how did we get here?
By insidious design. It didn't happen overnight. It's been a long, gradual process that's happened in stages. It was slow enough that the people either didn't notice, were unaware of it, or were complacent enough to accept it. It was a deception by increments. It reminds me of a slow drip anesthesia.
You know the story of the boiling frog? Have you heard that one?
Exactly. Another analogy. It's a perfect analogy.
Yeah. Well, let's start from the beginning then. As I recall, two factions were sitting around drafting the Constitution in Philly, my hometown.
My hometown too.
The Federalists and the Antifederalists.
Right.
Can you just run through the debate between them? From what I see, it seems like this division was the seed of all the contention we see today. Maybe we can blame it on them. What did each group envision?
Well, you know what, Rob, really, in all truth, it is the place to start. In a nutshell, the Federalists wanted a strong national government, believing the country needed it to work well. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, were worried that a strong federal government would become too powerful and take away states' rights and individual liberties. They wanted to keep most of the power at the state level. The states were to deal with domestic policy within their jurisdictions as independent nations. The federal government was to deal only with foreign policy. Okay? This is it in a nutshell.
The idea of these United States, not the United States.
Exactly. And that we'll get to that. That changed after the Civil War, that observation of these as opposed to the. The federal government.
In essence, it was a debate about how much power the federal government should have.
Exactly. The Anti-Federalists feared a strong federal government would lead to tyranny. They preferred a system where the states were independent. They believed that local communities should control their own affairs. The Federalists, however, and rightly so, pointed back to the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation in enforcing activities necessary for the defense against Great Britain in the recent war for independence.
Well, I guess we can boil this down to the divergent views of Federalists. Like, Alexander Hamilton, maybe James Madison and John Jay, and the Antifederalists like Thomas Jefferson and so forth.
Exactly.
Did the Federalists attempt to calm the fears of their opposition?
Well, the Federalists, in the Federalist Papers, argued that the Constitution created a system of checks and balances. They said that power was divided between the three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. So no one branch could become too powerful. Right? Also, they said the states would keep most of their power, and the federal government would only have specific powers. They promised there was nothing to fear because these protections were implicit in the wording of the Constitution.
I don't think they'd heard about bureaucratic bloat back then, did they?
No, but it
Well,
wasn't.
how
It
did
was
they convince? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, but you notice that the bureaucracy is not a fourth branch. There is no fourth branch. We'll get to this a little bit later on. And it's not a fourth branch of government. It was never designed to be.
Well, let me back us up just a little bit. How did they convince the Anti-Federalists to agree to the Constitution in the first place?
They didn't.
Huh.
The entire process was contentious with different points of view, proposals and compromises. Knowing history and human nature, the Anti-Federalists refused to take them at their word. They wanted everything spelled out with no ambiguity. You know, I mean, they wanted it written. It's got to be black on white.
You know, Dr. Tom, when we talked about the Articles of Confederation, it was never really clear to me what triggered them to write the Constitution in the first place.
Well, first of all, everyone knew the war brought to light many of the flaws in the Articles. Okay. They had difficulty collecting taxes. They had difficulty paying for the war effort. In other words, enforcement of government acts was haphazard at best. Okay. Then, during a meeting in Annapolis in 1786 to discuss regulating trade between the states, the idea of a grand convention to address the general shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation was brought up. Shortly thereafter, an armed insurrection in Massachusetts broke out protesting tax policies, right? Shays' Rebellion, as it was called, further demonstrated the weakness of the government under the Articles. These events led to the Confederation Congress on February 28, 1787, to endorse the need for a grand convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Okay? 3 months later, in May of 1787, the Constitutional Convention officially began in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania State House, what we call Independence Hall today, right? That's right. You know where it is. We've seen it 1,000 times. It convened until September 1787, when the final draft of the Constitution was completed. Now, only 39 of the 55 attendees signed the documents. Many delegates refused due to the lack of a Bill of Rights. Okay? So during those several months when they were drafting the Constitution, there was much debate over different state plans for the structure of the government and its powers, right? There were also key compromises that had to be hammered out. The Great Compromise, which was also called the Connecticut Compromise, established a bicameral legislature with the Senate having equal representation for each state and the House of Representatives based on population. The 3/5 Compromise, which allowed states to count 3/5 of their enslaved population for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. There was a Commerce Compromise, which allowed tariffs on imports but not exports, and granted the national government the power to regulate interstate trade. The Slave Trade Compromise, allowed the slave trade to continue for another 20 years. And the Electoral College, which established a system of electors from each state to elect the president. From there, the document was sent to the states for ratification. The public debates are the sources for the Federalist Papers in response to anti-Federalist concerns. Now, this is why the document begins with, in order to form a more perfect union. They were going away. They're trying to, perfect the Articles of Confederation. So, boy, that was a long-winded response.
Yeah, all right. So the Constitution was adopted without the Bill of Rights. But as I recall, they were amended in 1791.
Right. As I said, as an attempt to appease those anti-federalist concerns.
Did the Federalists and the Antifederalists, did they agree on the meaning of the Bill of Rights, or were they still at odds?
No, they still were at odds. The Federalists saw the Bill of Rights as guarantees for individuals against federal overreach, while the Anti-Federalists hoped that the Bill of Rights would prevent the federal government from encroaching on state power, okay, which is why we have the 10th Amendment, okay?
All right, let's summarize this. The Founding Fathers were concerned about centralized power. You can't blame them. After all, they just fought a war against a king, right?
Right.
So they designed a system of federalism with a strong emphasis on state sovereignty. The idea of dual sovereignty was intended for the states to check the power of the federal government and vice versa. For example, senators were initially, remember this, we had this in a previous podcast, they were initially appointed by state legislatures, acting as ambassadors to the states. They could be recalled at any time by the state.
Right, and we will see that.
Now we're in it for 6 years. Make a mistake and you live with it. This was a key mechanism for ensuring the states had a direct voice in federal affairs. So the states were much more directly represented at the federal level back then.
Right.
Now, we went over all of this in the previous episode. I think it was episode 6.
Precisely. The idea defines federalism. Guys like George Mason believed that the states needed to be directly represented to protect their rights. Even James Madison, a Federalist, warned against concentrated federal power and stressed state sovereignty.
It's almost like they knew this stuff was likely to happen.
Yeah.
Were there any indications the Anti-Federalists were justified in their fears after the Constitution was applied?
Well, even early on, there was tension. I mean, the Whiskey Rebellion from 1791 to 1794 was a violent tax protest that erupted primarily in Western Pennsylvania. It's our people against the federal excise tax on whiskey. Okay. Then 4 years later, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, authored by Madison and Jefferson, were a clear protest reaction against the Alien and Sedition Acts to curtail federal overreach. It's telling that they both had to hide their identity. After they wrote these resolutions, they hid them for 25 years. That tells you what kind of fear of retribution was already present. All right. Then you go a little bit further on. Another came under Andrew Jackson and his fight with Nicholas Biddle to kill the Second American Bank. Right. That was in Philadelphia. As a matter of fact, the Second American Bank building is right behind Independence Hall in Philly. You could still see the building. Right? Well, in any case, at that particular time, several states actively opposed the creation of a central bank and even instructed their senators how to vote. Some senators were forced to resign when they voted against the wishes of their state legislatures.
Well, it sounds like the states were within their rights to do that.
There is no question. No question.
We went over the aftermath of the Civil War in previous discussions. Wasn't this a dynamic shifting of power towards the federal government? The Civil War itself?
No question. The Civil War is a critical turning point. Before it, the states that would eventually become the Confederacy foresaw an increasing slide into Hamiltonian federalism as imminent with the election of Abraham Lincoln. Interestingly, the country ran just fine with the Jeffersonian model until Lincoln. If you read carefully the Constitution of the Confederate States, you will immediately recognize it as the heir of Jeffersonian anti-federalism. The severe flaw, I have to say this, was the recognition of slavery as an institution. It was a huge mistake. I believe the immorality and the affront to humanity doomed their aspirations of maintaining and reinforcing state sovereignty. They shouldn't have linked the two together in the same document. You can get an understanding of how each side viewed the war by what they called it. To the Southerners, it was the Second American Revolution, or the war against Northern aggression. To the Northerners, it was the War of the Rebellion. To this day, the U.S. government documents still call it that. It was never technically a civil war to either side.
I thought it was called the War of Succession.
No, it was called the War of Secession, but the Northerners, they referred to it as the War of the Rebellion. And in all government documents, that's how it's referred to. All right. It was a rebellion against the Union. That's how they saw it. Okay. But the Southerners did not see it that way. Okay. In any case, the federal government significantly expanded its powers during the war and after with the Reconstruction. The Lincoln administration introduced the greenbacks. You remember we talked about that in previous episodes. The first federal income tax, the stamp tax, the inheritance tax, and national banking legislation. Lincoln eliminated habeas corpus, shut down 300 newspapers, and arrested politicians and anyone who denounced his constitutional violations. You see, wartime creates an environment where centralization is necessary, and this period was no exception.
So the federal government grew during the Civil War, right?
Yes, and that power never fully receded afterwards. The prevailing view shifted to one where the federal government could do anything the states could do, and more securely. This was their view. This shows how the balance began to shift from the states, to the federal government.
Yeah, it's funny, Dr. Tom, the power gained only goes one way. It's never backwards.
Yes.
Isn't that called the ratchet effect? When federal power expands during a crisis, but rarely shrinks afterward.
Exactly. And this began to happen during and after the Civil War,
So where did the transfer of power and growth go from there? Let's get to that.
Well, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a gradual and insidious increase in federal power. It should be stated that the narrative surrounding the causes of the Civil War shifted. Now, this is important, with the Confederacy's lost cause assertion being denigrated. Okay? Now, the propaganda portrayed the motivation for secession as primarily the maintenance of slavery. This narrative change helped to undermine the concept of championing states' rights in the minds of Americans. To be clear, I'm not saying that slavery wasn't a reason. It was one reason, but not the reason. And we know this by if you were to ask the soldiers why they were fighting, they would tell you, both North and South.
What did they tell you? If you were to ask the soldiers that fought on the Confederate side, what would they say to you?
Well, there was an interesting go-between between three captured Confederate soldiers at Gettysburg, and when a Union officer asked them, why are you guys fighting? They said, because you came down here, and you came down here. We're fighting for states' rights. You came down here. You invaded my home. That's how they saw it. It wasn't in the interest
of farmers. They weren't politicians. No, they were landowners, farmers.
They were poor farmers, and the overwhelming majority of people that were fighting never owned a slave. And on top of it, slavery was a detriment to their own economic well-being. There's a majority of the fighters in the Confederate troops. It wasn't a question of slavery. It was a question their homes were invaded. In the North, they were trying to maintain the Union, keep the Union together. When that changed with the Emancipation Proclamation, it caused a lot of problems in the North, because the Union soldiers saying, I'm not going to go and kill myself to free slaves. What do I got to do with slaves? There were riots in Boston and New York. As a matter of fact, Lincoln bombarded 5 Points in New York. He sent the Navy up there to bombard them because of the anti-draft riots. These people said, "You're gonna free all these slaves, and they're gonna come up and take our jobs." You know, the people aren't stupid. Of course, I'm not trying to justify slavery, not at all. But the common man was more interested in his own economic well-being. In any case, this set the stage, okay? This set the stage.
All right. So how do we go from there to the modern era?
Well, there were several key steps. And we start with, believe it or not, with the Department of Justice. That was created in 1870 under the Grant administration. Eventually, they created the Bureau of Investigation in 1908, okay? And later it was renamed the FBI. From there, it began to move police powers from the states to the federal government. And the U.S. Code was beginning to be compiled. These are penal codes, okay, that the federal government was never supposed to have. But this became a model for the statutory creation of administrative bureaucracies. But the real turning point was the Revolution of 1913. This was a term coined by Dr. Tom DiLorenzo, okay?
I already know where you're going with this. Bureaucrats with guns. And we went over this in a previous episode, but for our listeners, could you restate why 1913 is so significant?
Sure. The 16th Amendment established a permanent federal income tax, which allowed the federal government to reach directly into the pockets of citizens. Now, before this point, the federal government operated for the most part, with the exception of the period of the Civil War, they operated for the most part with tariffs, collecting rents, fines, selling government land, that kind of thing. But they needed to have the ability to reach their hands into the pockets of the citizens. Dr. DiLorenzo notes that this was an attack on private property, and he called it the reverse of the Revolution of 1787. He likened it to Willie Sutton's answer when he was asked, "Why do you rob banks?" He responded, "Because that's where the money is." Makes sense, right? You see, it was in the time frame that those in government were seeking other streams of income for the federal government aside from those permitted by the Constitution. Like I said, tariffs, rents, sales of government property, and excise taxes.
Well, I think we're headed to the point where we talk about my favorite, the Federal Reserve System.
Exactly. It consolidated federal power over the economy with a private banking system. Okay? It was a sidestep since the Constitution does not provide for a central bank. A de facto one had to be created that mirrored the Bank of England. We went over this. We went over previous episodes. We also went over this coordinated effort to have a stable tax flow for the government to guarantee loans from the Federal Reserve. Okay? We went over that in a previous episode as well.
And let's get to the 17th Amendment.
It's what we would say in Italian is the colpo di grazia, or the French coup de grace, however you want to call it. Colpo di grazia. It came with the 17th Amendment. It mandated the direct election of senators, ending the practice of state legislatures appointing them, right? This was a fundamental change. It eliminated the role of the states as checks on federal power. It effectively nullified the concept of federalism from the government. This was precisely the lost cause coming to fruition that the ex-Confederates lamented would occur. Okay? It's exactly why they fought to prevent that. But of course, if you mention the lost cause, you'll get denigrated. Oh, that's it was a hoax. It's not a hoax. They were anti-federalist Jeffersonians. They saw what was going to happen.
So when that happened, senators were no longer acting as, quote, ambassadors of the states.
Exactly. Then at the state level, the federal government was seen as a foreign government. It was an offshore government to them. Okay. They became, and here's the thing, Rob, these senators became just another group of politicians competing for power and graft in Washington. And I would argue that with the 17th Amendment, our republic was dissolved by definition. Now, instead of being susceptible to corruption at the single state level, they are corruptible on a national and international level. They are no longer answerable to their states' assemblies, as in the past. They get kickbacks and payoffs from PACs and foreign interests. That's what we're seeing writ large with USAID, for example.
You know, I've always seen these people getting rich at our expense, and I knew it couldn't have been by campaign contributions alone. I've asked myself many times why someone would spend millions to get elected to a job that pays a couple of $100,000 a year. I think it's clear now. It was never clear to me that the mechanism for these people to enrich themselves with the salaries they receive as a senator or a representative. There had to be a money-making machine under the hood that wasn't obvious to the American people.
Of course there was. You see, Rob, the fears of the Anti-Federalists have been proven right again and again throughout history. If there is an agency or department that can be abused, it will be abused. If there is a centralized power, it will be abused. You just cannot legislate morality, virtue, or adherence to the interests of the people. No amount of oath-taking can guarantee it either. The only way to ensure that no corruption occurs is to not create the agency or department where it may occur. That's why it was never intended at the federal level. The bureaucracy was never intended to be there. There was no fourth branch of government. There still isn't.
You know, a lot of the American people, many in the electorate, feel that these agencies, 4-letter, 3-letter agencies, are absolutely needed. You don't need to convince me about that. It seems logical. But Dr. Tom, let's talk about Woodrow Wilson. Wasn't he the most influential agent of corruption against the premise of our government?
Oh, you mean Mr. Progressive? Wilson was vocal about overturning the original design of the U.S. government. He saw the Constitution as an outdated obstacle. He wanted a dynamic government freed from its chains, all right?
Sounds a bit Marxist to me.
No, it certainly was. He considered it all outdated principles. He wanted to discard the traditional checks and balances. Wilson's vision put governance in the hands of an elite class of administrative experts rather than, following the chaotic business of self-government. Okay? The aim was the complete destruction of the concept of individual rights and limited government power that were enshrined in our nation's founding documents. I'd argue that Wilson's emphasis on science and expertise as a guiding force was the cornerstone of the eventual rapid expansion of federal power and the rise of an unaccountable bureaucracy. Wilson's actions, including his segregationist racist views and praise for the film Birth of a Nation, showed a willingness to use government power to enforce his vision on society. His rejection of inherent individual rights and the promotion of a managed, directed population as part of a collective represent a stark departure from the principles of liberty and self-determination. It was Marxism, pure and simple. This departure has directly led to the overreaching federal government we're battling today.
Yes, government reimagined, unburdened by what has been.
Yeah.
I would have placed a winning bet that that's what you would have said.
Oh, yeah. Wow. You would have won. Now, Rob, I want to make one thing clear. Now listen carefully. The Hamiltonians understood tyranny just as well as the Jeffersonians. They fought together. All right, they understood it. However, I don't believe either group could have imagined anything other than a monarchy being corrupted into a tyranny. The Antifederalists only needed to recognize malevolent and corrupt human desires to justify their views. It happened in Rome. It was happening in France. The Federalists, on the other hand, had no way of knowing their ideas would direct the country toward a centralization of power that could be usurped by stealth, by a corrosive infiltration and infection of an ideology called Marxism. It didn't exist in their day. They had no idea that a Woodrow Wilson or an FDR was in their future who could smooth talk an inconceivably destructive ideology into the fabric of the federal government.
So you're indicating that they couldn't have known what they couldn't have known. Well, I know that 1913 was the start of the progressive era. It began with Teddy Roosevelt and then enshrined by Woodrow Wilson. And we could talk volumes about Wilson, but we're running a bit long, so I'd like to hop over the Great War and go into the Great Depression. You know, this discussion could not possibly avoid FDR and the New Deal. In episode 15 of the Liberty Brief, New Legislation, The Lie is in the Name, that was the title, we discussed the creation of the Federal Reserve System. We also explained how the Fed used the 1929 collapse to consolidate its power by contracting the money supply and to kill off its competition from state chartered banks. I think you said 1/3 of the banks went belly up at that time. Regarding the government's reaction, this is where I can contribute to the history of the evolution of the administrative state.
You're right. Extending the Depression as long as possible was in the interests of the Federal Reserve and those in the federal government. It was a prolonged tightening of the screws to the American people that provided them the perfect tactical opportunity to seize control. One that had our people suffering and begging for relief on the part of the federal government. But go right ahead. Tell us what you know.
Well, I think I know that they were begging for relief, and who better to provide it but the federal government?
Yeah.
During the Great Depression, the U.S. government grew in size and power like never before. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal resulted in an explosion of dozens and dozens of what we now call the alphabet agencies to try and fix the country's problem. Every one of them caused by the government itself.
Yeah.
Well, before the Depression, most of the issues addressed by the New Deal were handled by the individuals, their local communities, or their state governments. But as the Depression worsened, there was a general public outcry for the federal government to step in and relieve them, to take some kind of action. So those new federal agencies commandeered responsibilities such as regulating banks, the stock market, providing financial assistance to the states, creating jobs through public works projects, establishing national standards for social welfare and labor practices. Believe it or not, Roosevelt's administration looked to Hitler and Mussolini's policies for inspiration.
Why wouldn't I believe it? They all had shared Marxist values and central planning.
Exactly. And while these programs were cynically sold to America to help people and get the economy back on track, in reality, they shifted the balance of power between the federal government and the states, with the federal government becoming much more involved in areas that were previously managed locally. They also moved towards making our citizens dependent on the federal government. Remember, we talked about this, the ratchet effect. Didn't we also describe mission creep?
Yes,
in other episodes of this podcast? Yeah, we did. And many of those programs and agencies continue to exist today, showing the lasting impact of the New Deal on the role of the federal government in American life.
Yeah, yeah. Now, for brevity, let's not even get into Johnson and the Great Society. The result is what Democrats believe to be, as I said, a fourth branch of government, the Leviathan bureaucracy. The one flaw in their game plan is that it is in direct contradiction to the Constitution. There is no fourth branch in the structure of our government, and there was no amendment even calling for one. Every time a new regulatory agency is created, it is by structure placed under the direct control of the executive branch, increasing the power of the president by orders of magnitude. The government has become a highly centralized system that the founders would not recognize. Federal power continues to expand, especially during crises, and those expansions never recede. We have an enormous administrative state with regulatory agencies wielding immense power with little to no oversight. President Trump and Elon Musk, as well as everyone else in his administration, are aiming at this beast. The knee-jerk reactions of the Democrats are precisely what I would have expected. Mass temper tantrums, foul language, childish foot stomping, deflections, and frank lies. DOGE is exposing it all. I have to laugh my ass off at cries of constitutional crisis by the left. I mean, they have been systematically hacking away at the spirit and letter of the Constitution for well over 120 years. I mean, look at these pissant, supposedly learned judges who think they have any authority over the executive branch with their puny, unthinking TROs. Who the hell do they think they are, trying to tell the president what he can and cannot do as chief executive? He has core constitutional authority over what Congress has created for him to administer. End of story. But these people think that they are completely outside, of the control of the powers of the government.
Up until Trump, my thought was that this was hopeless beyond the idea of a convention of states. But is it really hopeless?
No, it's not hopeless, but it requires an understanding of the real problem. It's not just about making government more efficient. It's about restoring the balance of power between the states and the federal government. We need to critically examine the structure of government rather than just focusing merely on efficiency, waste, and fraud. This should be a necessary responsibility regardless of the state of the government. Okay? We need to talk about how to roll back federal power, restore state sovereignty, and return to the original principles of the Constitution and cement them in stone through the amendment process. We cannot permit them to sprout up again. Look, DOGE is a brilliant and needed first step, but remember, as long as these administrative bureaucracies exist, they will be abused by corrupt intentions. Also, never forget that anything created by statute can be abolished by statute. Anything created by an executive order can be eliminated by an executive order.
Dr. Tom, it's been incredibly insightful, and I want to thank you for shedding light on this complex issue.
It's been my pleasure, Rob. It's a conversation we need to keep having. I don't want people to get deflected by what they're seeing, by what they're seeing in the news. The more serious problem is a return to the original, outline of the federal Constitution. They've got to be reined in, these people. So anyway, that's my view.
And it's about time. That's about all the time we have for today's episode of the Liberty Brief. Join us next time as we continue to discuss the pressing issues affecting our freedom.
You've been listening to The Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.